Get started. Can everyone hear me okay? I heard that this was all set up for the magic show, and I wish I could stand up here and do tricks for you, but I don't know any. So we'll just have to talk politics instead. I want to thank all of you for coming out on this snowy and cold and windy day. It was a beautiful drive coming over here, although I will admit that around the Elk Mountain area things got a little bit wild, but we made it through, and hopefully that storm will have gone on through to Cheyenne by the time we leave here today. It is great to see all of you. This is my, what did I say? This is my 73rd town hall in the last 3 years. So when I ran for office, I did a town hall in every county, and I promised at that time that I would come back to every single county every year and do another town hall. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not out and about the rest of the time when I'm back in Wyoming. I spend a lot of time in various places for meetings and meeting with county leaders, taking tours, addressing healthcare issues, a lot of different things. But I like to come and do the town halls because it gives me an opportunity to do two things. One, it allows me to give you an overview and an update of what's happening back in Washington, D.C., which I'll give you a brief update in that regard. But the other thing that it does is it allows me to hear from you. So I take this opportunity to answer your questions. Now, this looks like a very good and respectful crowd, and I thank you for all of that. For those of you who may have heard about the last couple of days, I am here to report we survived just fine. I actually kind of enjoyed it. I probably shouldn't admit that, but it was an interesting experience on Saturday. But even with some of the disruptions, we had an opportunity to engage in dialogue with a lot of people. But I also want to make sure that your voices are heard as well. And it is important. It's one thing to yell and scream and shout me down. It's another thing to be doing that to the crowd. And I know that there were people who were upset in Sweetwater County that that's what happened. But I'll have other opportunities to get over there and meet with those folks. I love that area. I've spent a lot of time over there, and I want to make sure that I get back and can engage with everyone there. I'm first, as I said, going to give you an overview of what we've been doing in Congress, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. The first bill that was enacted into law for the 119th Congress was the Laken-Riley Act. And that is a product of the Judiciary Committee. I'm on the Judiciary Committee, so we were the ones that marked that up and approved that bill, and then it went to the floor, it passed. What it does is it mandates detention for illegal aliens arrested for theft, assault of a police officer, and other crimes resulting in death and serious injury. If you remember, this is named after the beautiful young nursing student from Georgia who was killed by the illegal alien. I was very honored to be able to attend this signing at the White House when the president signed it. And in light of what his agenda has been and what he's been talking about for the last couple of years, I thought it was very appropriate for this to be the first bill of his presidency. It was a very emotional day. Laken's parents and her sister were there, as were other parents who had gone through something very similar. Jocelyn Lengary's mother was there. Others were there as well, and so it was an opportunity for us to engage with them and envelop them and really feel the pain that they have gone through because of the failed immigration policies of the last administration. Just in the last couple of weeks, on February 25th, I voted in favor of the House budget resolution. What this does is it instructs Congress to enact at least $1.5 trillion in mandatory savings. It will provide up to $300 billion for additional border security, and it will also prevent $4.5 trillion in tax hikes and extend the debt limit by $4 trillion. This is really a budget framework. The House has done our budget resolution, the Senate has done their budget resolution. We're now working together to bring those together so we can come up with one budget package. As soon as that's done, we get to move into the reconciliation process. And what reconciliation is it is a circumstance. It's called budget reconciliation. Everything that we do in that regard has to be associated with the budget. It cannot be specifically oriented. But the reason that budget reconciliation is so important with where we are right now in history is that the Republicans have the White House, the Senate, and the House. With budget reconciliation, we only have to have 50 votes in the Senate rather than the typical 60. In other words, we can implement the policies that we all ran on, that President Trump ran on. We can implement the budget policies that we ran on through the reconciliation process, and we are working on that right now. On March 11th, I voted in favor of the continuing resolution. I'm not a huge fan of continuing resolutions. I feel like we are really kicking the can down the road. It's not the right way that we ought to be budgeting. The reason that I voted for this one is a couple of reasons. One is that it actually extends funding all the way through the end of this fiscal year. And the reason that we were put in the position of having to do a CR is the House has actually done its job. The House of Representatives did its job last year, and we passed 7 of our 12 budget bills. So we were funding we had done budget bills that funded almost 80% of the government, but the Senate under Chuck Schumer would not take them up. And so as a result, they just sat there and there was no effort to move forward with a budget. So right before Christmas, you may remember, there was an effort to kind of shove an omnibus spending bill down our throats. And I can assure you that there was a hue and cry among people like me who said, we're not doing an omnibus spending bill. We'll do a CR. We will continue spending at its current levels, but we are going to stop what they have done for decades, which is just put massive amounts of spending in these omnibus spending bills that nobody even knows until long after the fact what they've done. The worst one was under Nancy Pelosi. The last year she was Speaker of the House. It was $2 trillion, and it had stuff in there that we're still trying to unravel. It was just a terrible mess of a bill. So I won't do omnibus spending bills. I don't like those. But what we did do with this CR is it actually keeps spending flat, and in an inflationary situation like what we're in, it, in fact, cuts federal spending, which is something that we've been unable to do for a long time. That's part of the reason that I voted for it. Just a few of the things that it did is it rescinds $20 billion in agency slush funds. It provides $485 million for alien detention and removal, and it also, very importantly, provides a pay raise for our junior enlisted men and women. We have been trying to get them a pay raise for quite some time, but again, because Schumer would not take up our budget bills, we were unable to do that. So we have now been able to do that through the CR to get a pretty good raise for our junior enlisted military men and women. We also, in terms of my legislative update, as I just mentioned, I'm on the Judiciary Committee again, and I'm also on Natural Resources Committee. Those are two committees that really make sense for me and for Wyoming. With my legal background, it makes sense that I'm on Judiciary and that I focus a lot on the constitutional and court type questions and issues. And then for Natural Resources, obviously, it's so important for the state of Wyoming. I've been honored this year to be appointed as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries. That particular subcommittee accounts for about 60% of the work that the Natural Resources Committee does. I'm responsible for overseeing the wet side of NOAA, for example. ESA reform will come within my committee, and we're working right now on Endangered Species Act reform. NEPA reform will be coming through my committee, my subcommittee. Permitting reform will be coming through my subcommittee. There are a couple of priorities that I have. Obviously, a big one for my natural resources work and my subcommittee work is protecting our legacy industries here in Wyoming. Oil and gas, mining, livestock production. Those are always at the very forefront of my mind, and if you've ever heard me speak anywhere, those are some of the most important things that I believe that I address while I'm in Congress. But I also want to do more work in terms of forcing California to actually start building out more water infrastructure. They have the same water infrastructure in place today with 40 million people that they had in the 1960s with 16 million people. That's why we have the pressures that we do on the Colorado River system. It's why you had the fire situation catastrophe that we've had over the last couple of months. They are not managing their water resources well, and I do not believe that that is fair to the rest of the country, in part because we're ultimately going to have to pay for mitigating a lot of the catastrophes that did happen last fall with those fires. I know that they're coming to us with a supplemental budget request. We're looking at potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in damages, and we have to make sure that this never happens again. So I have recently met with some folks who have come up with a new way of doing desalination that doesn't take nearly the electricity or power, and also is a much more efficient way of desaling water, which I think it's just a pilot project that they're going to be starting in April. I don't know if it's the answer, but the information they provided to me was pretty doggone exciting, and I think that it could really do great things for our coastal communities. I also was selected to chair the RSC's Article 1 Task Force. And the mission there is to reclaim Congress's legislative authority in the wake of overturning of the Chevron decision. For those of you who have heard me speak in the past, you know that one of my biggest issues is regulatory reform. I have been adamant that Congress and our legislative branch need to make sure that they are retaking their rightful authority as the ones who write the laws. I'm answerable to you. I come to Baggs or to Rollins or Saratoga or Cheyenne or Rock Springs or Jackson or wherever it is. I'm answerable to you. I come and talk to you. I engage with you. My staff is fabulous in terms of addressing your issues and the challenges that you have. In fact, since I've been in office, my staff we have been able to return $5.5 million to citizens right here in the state of Wyoming that was being wrongfully withheld by some type of a federal agency. Whether that is getting VA services reimbursed or it is through the IRS, we have been able to return $5.5 million, not to agencies, not to the state, but to individuals in the state of Wyoming. But that's also why we have the form of government that we have. It is a representative form of government. It's a constitutional republic. So what I'm trying to do is actually force members of Congress to be better practitioners at the legislating role. Write better laws. Be more precise. Don't be vague and ambiguous. Write definitions, write preambles as to the intent of the law. Have sunset provisions so we get to revisit these issues down the road. So what I'm doing is educating the folks in Congress about what the Administrative Procedure Act does, what's happened with the agencies over the last 50 years especially, and how we can reclaim our authority. Also, in terms of the summary of what I've done so far, I have introduced 23 bills and I have co-sponsored 94 bills. 106 bills have actually passed out of the House, and we had one bill, as I said a moment ago, the Lake and Riley Act, that has been signed into law. We also have a couple of what's called, and then we have the CR that just passed, so that's the second bill that's been signed into law. On the first day of the 119th Congress, I actually introduced what's called the First Amendment Accountability Act. And over the last several years, I think every one of us have recognized that our federal government has been very busy at attempting to restrict our First Amendment rights. The 5 pillars being freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to petition your government for redress, freedom to peaceably assemble, and freedom of religion. And COVID especially, I mean, it was just absolutely off the charts in the way that our government took away our rights and limited our ability to exercise those rights. So, but right now, we don't really have a remedy for that. We can't necessarily sue somebody in the federal government who has taken away one of our First Amendment rights. So I've introduced the First Amendment Accountability Act, and it says that for any federal employee who violates one of our First Amendment rights, they can be held liable at law, you can get an injunction against them, and you could get attorney's fees. And I'll give you an example of where this would have played out had it been in effect. We know that recently with the storms that happened down southeast, we had the Department of Homeland Security that was actually not going to homes that had Trump signs in the yard. Well, that is viewpoint discrimination. An agency, FEMA, does not have the ability to discriminate against you based upon your viewpoint, whether it is a Trump sign or a Biden sign. Under my law, those homeowners would have been able to sue the federal government for violating their First Amendment right. So that is what I want to make sure that we've got accountability. And I am a strict constitutionalist, and I think this is one area where we need to bolster the rights of our citizens. I'm going to continue to champion legislation that is specific to Wyoming. I've introduced the bill to delist the grizzly bears. I've introduced a bill to end the federal coal moratorium. And I also have introduced legislation to terminate the Biden's efforts to go forward with the Rock Springs RMP and the Buffalo RMP. Now, as you know, Doug Burgum also has pulled both of those off the table, so the Rock Springs RMP and the Buffalo RMP are hopefully being rewritten with more of our input as we speak. That will be absolutely critical to, again, protecting our legacy industries as well as recreation. So those are just some of the things that I continue to work on in Wyoming. And finally, well, not finally, but I'll talk very briefly. If you've been reading Cowboy State Daily, you're aware of the work that I have been doing to try to preserve our rural postal service. Under DeJoy, the previous heads of the U.S. Postal Service came up with a plan, and they were going to close all processing and distribution centers in the state of Wyoming. What that means is that our mail would be processed in Salt Lake, Denver, Billings, and it's going to have a huge impact. It'll have an impact on our ability to get medications. It'll have an ability for us to have mail-in voting. In fact, in Utah last June, when they had their primary, the mail for southern Utah is actually processed in Nevada. And even though people sent their ballots in early enough because it took so long to get processed in Nevada, people, their ballots were not counted. They were disenfranchised. So this is a very serious issue. We've been fighting it hard. John and Cynthia and I have, fighting to preserve rural service. And just in the last couple of weeks, the U.S. Postal Service says that they are going to retain 2 facilities in Wyoming, one in Casper, one in Cheyenne, and they intend to invest several $1 million in both of those facilities so that we can protect our rural service. As far as federal, I think that that's about it in terms of what I want to say with just giving you a summary. There's a lot of other things that we have been dealing with. As you can see, I mean, it's been kind of a crazy couple of months as we have been populating our committees, having committee hearings, doing additional oversight, trying to implement the agenda that the American people voted for in November of last year. But I think that this is probably the best time to open it up for questions. So I want to focus on what your issues are here. So do we have any questions, any comments?
I just want to clarify on what an RMP is.
It's a resource management plan, I'm sorry. So under the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976, every 10 years there is to be an RMP for particular geographic areas. So the Rock Springs district office is about 3.8 million acres. And over the last 12 years, they've been working on refining and rewriting the resource management plan that is already in existence. What happened under the previous administration was they went from management and basically use of our resources to shutting out recreation, stopping grazing, preventing the construction of right-of-ways, limiting mining, limiting oil and gas development. So they picked an alternative that they had been working on that no one had ever studied in relation to that RMP, basically disenfranchising all the people who have worked for the last 10 to 12 years on it. So that's what an RMP is.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
What's your stance on the strategic Bitcoin reserve that Cynthia Lummis has presented to President Trump?
He's asking about the strategic Bitcoin reserve, and he was asking what my stance is. And my stance is I follow Cynthia Lummis. I have my area of expertise and she has her area of expertise. And I don't know as much as she does. And I know that she has studied this extensively. So I kind of take my lead from her. And I just think that that's what we have to do. With being the only representative in the state of Wyoming especially, I don't necessarily have other people that I can work with in the House like a lot of our delegations do. So John and Cynthia and I, we have our specific areas of expertise and we kind of work with each other that way.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Since you're on an environmental committee, has there been any consideration to stopping the geoengineering of the chemtrails that are being spread across our nation?
She's asking about the chemtrails and whether there's been any discussion about the geoengineering associated with that. I don't have a lot of information about the chemtrails. I know that we get questions about it. That is not something that has come up in committee to date. I can talk to Bruce Westerman about it. He is the chairman of that committee, and I can ask him what information he has. He's a representative from Arkansas.
Okay. Well, then
I don't think that that would come within our jurisdiction. I actually think that that might be technology, science and technology, or commerce and industry, C&I. It might be one of those.
okay, and what about a bill that would limit terms for Congress?
You want to talk about term limits for Congress? There was a bill introduced 2 years ago, and I killed it in committee. And I will tell you why I killed term limits in committee is I don't believe in them. And the reason is that I already believe that the administrative agencies and the executive branch has become much more powerful than was ever intended by our Constitution. If you read the way that our Constitution is put together, Article 1 governs the legislative branch. That is supposed to be the most powerful branch that there is, again, because we're answerable to you. And especially in the House. I have to come back every 2 years and run for office, explain to you what I'm doing and engage with you. If we were to put term limits in place, essentially what we would do would be nullifying the legislative branch. I think we need to strengthen it. I think that we need to limit the power of the executive branch to be able to pass laws through regulations in that way. So I have always been very opposed to term limits. I also believe when you look statistically, both in the state of Wyoming as well as Congress, there's a lot more turnover than I think people realize. You have Nancy Pelosi. We all have Nancy Pelosi, and that's the kind, she and Chuck Schumer are two of them that we think about, and we all think, man, it sure would be nice to have term limits. And I don't disagree with that, but you're also getting rid of people who are really, really, really good at their job. I think of some of the people who came in with me as freshmen were now sophomores. The people who are in the military who have such incredible expertise, whether they are Navy SEALs or some of the doctors that have given up their careers to come and work on healthcare legislation. I think that the moment that we do term limits, I think we become a completely different kind of government than what was intended by our founders. I know some people disagree with me on that, and we can have a legitimate conversation. But I did kill that in committee because I just think it's the wrong thing to do. Right back here.
I'll stand up because my voice isn't very loud. As part of cutting government waste, the education department, or part of the education department, is on the chopping block. I'm a teacher, and I know of many other teachers who have no qualms about the federal Department of Education being cut. We do have concerns about our special needs students and the federal funding for IEPs and special education. I just wanted to ask you if you know Congress has a plan or something to ensure that funding not only gets to the state, but has stipulations about how the state can spend it, because I don't know if I trust our legislature right now either to make sure that money still goes to the students.
So I appreciate the question, and it is about education and what happens when the federal Department of Education is cut back. And will we be able to continue to fund those programs that are funded by the federal resources that we have, such as the IEPs, the individual education plans. I have a sister who was a special ed teacher for many, many years. I was the IEP coordinator for the middle school in Laramie for Albany County until she passed away last year. I have a sister-in-law who continues in that role in Guernsey. Most of my family members, my mom, my grandma, my aunts, my sisters, my sister-in-laws, they all went into education. And if you remember, my dad was the chairman of the education committee for the Wyoming legislature for many, many years. The federal Department of Education did not come into existence until 1980. And I am an example of what we educated prior to the federal Department of Education, because I graduated from high school in 1981. I believe that people like you and our administrators here in the state of Wyoming and our legislators are so much more capable of taking care of the educational needs of our citizens than the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. ever would be. And I actually have voted twice now to abolish the federal Department of Education. Not because, again, I don't believe in education. I believe it is a local issue. I had some of the most phenomenal teachers in the world. I went to school at Lingle Fort Laramie High School, 125 kids in our school, 30 kids in my class, which was a big one. But I can tell you the name of every teacher that I ever had, because I had such phenomenal teachers. And again, I love the industry itself. But the problem that we have is so much of our bureaucracy in DC is a matter of churning money and wasting money. The Federal Department of Education spends over $280 billion, but only about 25% of that is actually spent on education. So I am a co-sponsor of a bill with Chip Roy where we would be block granting money to the state of Wyoming. What I like about this idea is you have a superintendent of public instruction, you have a state board of education, but more importantly, you have local school boards. And your local school boards are the ones who would be making decisions about educating our kids. And I think that a fallacy that we have is that if we don't believe in the Federal Department of Education, or if we don't believe that that should be bureaucratized, we don't believe in education. I can tell you from the moment that I could speak, I had parents who were teaching me how to speak correctly. That is inculcated in us. We believe very strongly in education in this country because we recognize what it does in terms of raising people out of poverty. And whether it is education where you go on and become an attorney like me, or it's education where you go through one of our welding programs, or you go through our electrical programs and become some of the workers that we need to be building our highways. We have done a phenomenal job of educating people in this state and in this country, despite the Federal Department of Education, not because of it. I want education to come back here where it belongs, because I trust every single person in this room to make better decisions about what is in the best interest of your children than somebody in Washington, D.C. who is paid hundreds of thousands of dollars simply to pursue indoctrination or an agenda. So I'm actually really, really excited about where we are with what's going on with the streamlining of government. I think that that's one agency that we know we can do away with, and it's probably going to be better for everybody involved. Right here. How are you, Sharon?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Do you see any solutions for the Environmental Justice Act? How that's recognized?
Did you say the Environmental Justice Act?
Oh,
Oh, Equal Access to Justice Act. You know, there needs to be major reform to that. She's asking about the Equal Access to Justice Act, and what that is, the EAJA. It was passed by Congress many years ago, and the idea was that if the federal government sues you, or you have to sue them, and you end up prevailing, you should not have to pay your own attorney's fees and costs. And I'll give you an example of a case that I had several years ago. It was a gentleman who moved an irrigation ditch on his property up near Warland. He affected 2.1 acres of land on his property, and the EPA came in a test case and said that that was a navigable water of the United States. So they sued him, claiming that he needed to have a 404 permit in order to clean out and move his irrigation ditch. Well, that wasn't true. That's not what the Clean Water Act says. But we had to fight that case because it was really being run out of Washington, D.C. Again, it was an effort to use the Clean Water Act to take control of our irrigation infrastructure, which would be a disaster for the western United States. So we fought that case all the way through trial. When he went to trial, he was facing penalties of almost $65 million. Because at the time, the agency could impose fines of $37,500 a day. It's now up to $68,000 a day. So when we finally went to trial, we were at almost $65 million. We had a 2-week trial. We prevailed. We won in that case. But when I filed for my attorney's fees under the EAJA, the judge wouldn't let me have them because he didn't want me to win. He wanted me to lose that case. His reaction was, his viewpoint was, you know what, whether you legally needed to get a 404 permit or not isn't really the question. He should have just done it and then he would have avoided this situation. Well, that's not the way that the law works. But that's the problem, is the EAJA has become a way really of laundering money from the federal government to their favored groups. So the Sierra Club, NRDC, the World Wildlife Federation, Earth Justice, the World Heritage Forests, I can go on and on and on. Whenever they win these cases, and usually they're sue and settle, they can get $300, $400, $500, $600 an hour for their work. But here I was, just a little old attorney in Cheyenne, Wyoming, fighting an incredibly important national case. And my client, it cost him $1 million in attorney's fees and costs, expert witness fees. It took us 6 years to get to trial. An incredibly expensive case, but the judge would not give us JAILBIRD funds. I know that Cynthia Lummis and I have talked about this. We have talked about abolishing the JAILBIRD because it isn't fair. It's a way of laundering money. At the same time, I hate to do away with it because there should be some mechanisms to make it so that people can get those fees and costs. So I'm continuing to look at it. It's not as easy as it should be. It was passed exactly to address the kind of case that I had. That was exactly what the JAILBIRD was adopted, that if the federal government comes after you, wrongfully comes after you, and you win, you shouldn't have to lose $1 million in that fight. But it has been politicized like so many other things have. We'll keep working on it.
Well, it's a cash cow,
It is.
please.
It is. It's a cash cow. It's what keeps them alive. It's what Earth Justice, that's how Earth Justice makes its money, is off the federal government. Yes, sir.
Sorry to ask a second question. The Corporate Transparency Act, I just had to pay a whole bunch of extra fees to my accountant this year to make sure I'm in compliance to get yet another chunk of my privacy taken away from me.
Did you file your documents?
Yes.
Okay, so the Corporate Transparency Act is on hold right now. And I'm the co-sponsor of a bill with a gentleman out of Ohio named Warren Davidson to repeal the Corporate Transparency Act. And for those of you in here, this was a bill that was supposed to allegedly go after money launderers and drug dealers, but it just sucked everybody into it. It only applies to businesses that are 25 people or less, so it specifically targets our smallest businesses in the country. And the idea is that you have to give all of the information about the ownership of that business, of your business. So you have to have your driver's license, and you have to have all kinds of personal information. And take it from me, someone who's already had my personal information compromised because I'm a federal employee and there was a hack and they got all my information. And now I'm having to deal with that. I don't trust them taking this kind of information, but it's another doggone business. So we have been trying to get it stopped for quite some time. Again, I have a bill to do that, but the Trump administration has indicated that they are not going to enforce it. But one of the worst things about it, and this is what I was saying a little bit ago about our representatives not being good practitioners, that bill, that statute is so poorly written you don't even know if you've complied with it. You can go through all of the work of filling out the forms, and when you sign your name on the dotted line, you are potentially subject to criminal penalties, going to prison, as well as substantial fines, and you don't know if you complied with the law because it's so poorly written you can't tell if you've provided enough information. That is a classic example of an unconstitutional law for vagueness. So even for that reason alone, it needs to be pulled out. I just don't think that the federal government needs to know our business. They don't need to know our information. If you want to go after drug dealers and money launderers, go after drug dealers and money launderers, not our farmers and ranchers and implement dealers and irrigation districts and HOAs and things like that. So we're trying to get that off the books entirely.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I have a question about these lower level judges.
District court judges?
Yeah, telling all the way up what they can do and what they can't. Is that legal?
So one of the challenges that we've had for a long time is district court judges who issue what are called nationwide injunctions. And I think that that is something that is going to go by the wayside because of this kind of behavior. The reason that we have all of the various district courts and the circuit courts is because different judges may see things a little bit differently. That's actually how you elevate things up to the Supreme Court, is you get what's called a split in the circuit. I think that, well, I'll put it this way. The other night I was asked a question in Evanston, and this person wanted me to commit that I would never support an impeachment of a judge. And I said, well, I don't have the facts in front of me and I'm not committing to anything. I will assess each factual situation as it comes before me. But I said, the problem that you're seeing is that you guys have played lawfare for so long that it has undermined how people view our judiciary. You have so undermined our faith in our judiciary by going after Donald Trump, by having New York actually redo the statute of limitations and give a woman from an incident that allegedly happened 20 years ago, allowing her to sue now. The Fani Willis situation where she was conspiring with the January 6th committee. I said, you have so undermined our faith in the judiciary that people are very angry, and they do not believe that the judges have the authority to do what they're doing. And so this idea that they can issue these injunctions, especially on foreign policy matters, I think is absolutely ludicrous. And I think that a person in the State Department who's been there since 1972 said it best, and he explained this. He said, what is happening with these individuals that are being taken to El Salvador, that is a classic, perfect example of foreign policy decision-making. The Trump administration has negotiated with Venezuela and El Salvador of what to do with their citizens, what to do with them. And you have a judge who is coming in and saying, we don't care what you negotiated with a foreign country. I'm going to make a decision about what you can do. That is an absolutely ludicrous prospect. I do believe that the higher court, the appellate court, will reverse that if it hasn't already happened. If it does go to the Supreme Court, I think the Supreme Court will clearly reverse it. But I think what's happening is they're trying to buy time to see what they can do. But the other point I'll make is if you're taking the side of the rapists and the murderers, you're going down the wrong road. And I just think it's absurd what they are doing. It is not the way our judicial system is set up. We don't trump each other. In other words, I have my lane, I make the laws. The executive branch carries them out, and the judicial branch is just to interpret and resolve disputes. They're not to come in and tell the president what he can do, especially on foreign policy. Throughout history, that has always been within the purview of the president. Right over here. Yes, sir.
I had a question on that. There's a lot of alternative treatments for PTSD and drug addiction and things like that. Governor Rick Perry has talked a lot about it. They're not legal in the United States or available for veterans, but you can go down to Mexico and get them down there. So one of those treatments is Ibogaine. It's been proven effective. They've been using it. It's helped a lot of vets out, but you can't get it in the United States. Wondering how you felt about that.
Is it because of how it is classified? Because I'm not familiar with that. Would you get a hold of my office, perhaps, and give us some additional information so I can do some research on that? I don't have an answer off the top of my head, other than I can tell you that I think that our pharmaceutical situation in this country has some need for improvement. But I don't know about that particular issue, and so if you'll get a hold of my office, give us the information, we can see what we can find out and get back to you. I have Carly Miller, who's in the back of the room. She's my chief of staff, but you can also call my office, call Tyler in Cheyenne, and visit with him. He does a lot of my veterans issues. If you'll get a hold of him, we'll see what we can find out for you. Yes, Larry.
Harriet, one question, and you've kind of touched on a lot of water, block grants, Colorado River. One of the issues that we're facing under the Fraudulent Inflation Reduction Act, there was some bipartisan work to address some of the drought issues that affects everybody in this community on the Colorado River basin. One of the problems that we ran into is the $500 million was allocated for the upper basin, has been slow walked out, mishandled and misappropriated by
Who's handling it? Who's got that money? Bureau of Reclamation.
And we're sitting here right now. I think some of those funds have been frozen, probably rightfully so. But this should have been out on the ground, and it gets back to one of the things that we really pushed the Bureau of Reclamation hard on is block grant that to the states, focus on efficiency and conservation, not all of these other issues, and just your thoughts on how we move that forward to release those funds to do things like watershed management, water yield for forestry, conservation efficiency, to deal with it, because it affects everybody in this part of the state of Wyoming. Our largest industrial users with the Trona, and our largest municipality gets 40% of their drinking water out of this basin right here. So this is critical to this part of the state of Wyoming. What can we do, or what can you do to help to at least free up those funds and start to get this program, really look at the component of getting a block grants to the state to implement it, instead of having to have an individual water user here and deal with NEPA, National Historic Preservation, Clean Water Act, endangered species, and enter into a contract with the federal government to put in some gated pipe or spring.
So let me say a couple of things. We are, I'm a co-sponsor of the bill to do the pilot project for another 5 years for deferring water use so that we can continue to send water downstream. That is not a long-term answer, and I know that, and I think that there are potentially some unintended consequences that you and I both know about when you fail to irrigate over a period of time, and what that does with our aquifer, and ultimately how much water we're getting into the Green River. So I think we've got to really look at that, but we are going to go ahead and hopefully pass that to do another 5 years on that pilot project. I don't have the answer to your question right now. What we can do is we'll get a hold of Doug Burgum with the Department of Interior, find out where this is, whether it has in fact, what has been frozen, what can be released, what can be unfrozen, and whether there is a mechanism to more efficiently spend and use this money than what happens when we have to go through NEPA and ESA. I do believe that there's going to be a huge push over the next 2 years, especially once we can get through this reconciliation, to do some very important permitting reform, both with the ESA and, well, ESA, Fix Our Forest Act, which was already passed the House, and then also with permitting reform specifically to NEPA. You did see also that the President has withdrawn all CEQ regulations, Council on Environmental Quality regulations. One of the regulations that's in there is the cumulative analysis regulation. That has never been adopted by Congress. That is not part of NEPA. Pulling that cumulative analysis requirement out of NEPA would be absolutely huge for some of the projects that we have been working on over the years, especially with the nonsense surrounding global warming. So I think that is how that plays out. I think that there's already been a lawsuit filed about whether he has the authority to do that. But I think what he's arguing is that CEQ does not have rulemaking authority. And if that's the case, then these regulations, every one of them could go by the wayside. We'll see what the courts do with that, but I think that's a huge positive development. But Larry, we'll get a hold of Doug and we'll get back to you as soon as we can find out some information, okay? Right here.
I know you're working on Endangered Species Act reform, and I'm wondering, is there a way to make it so that there's a standard to get something delisted? Because right now, once something's listed, it's there forever.
So there is a standard for delisting, it's just that they won't follow it. So there's a 5-factor test that must be met to delist a species. And one of them is that it meets the recovery goals. So whenever, under the Endangered Species Act, whenever a species is listed, they set out what are the goals in terms of this particular species. So with the grizzly bear, the recovery goals were 500 bears within a particular geographic area. We call it the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, and that's Wyoming, part of Montana, and part of Idaho. And so that's a distinct population segment, and that was the recovery goal for that species. We met that by 2000. So for 25 years, we have had more grizzly bears than we're required to under the Endangered Species Act, under the recovery plan. In fact, we have more than double the bears that we are required to have. And we have petitioned both in, I think it was 2003, 2017, and then maybe again in 2020 to try to get the grizzly bear delisted because we meet all the criteria. What the environmental groups do, what the Fish and Wildlife Service does, and what the courts do is they look at one factor to determine whether there is an adequate regulatory mechanism in place to maintain a recovered wolf or a recovered population without it becoming threatened or extinct. Well, we clearly meet that under the, for the grizzly bear. We met it for 17 years with the gray wolves. It is absolutely established that the state of Wyoming has a very robust 400-page management plan in place that will make sure that we can always protect a recovered grizzly bear population. But we did such a good job of protecting the grizzly bear, spending millions of dollars here in the state of Wyoming, that they now essentially want to use us as the nursery for the other 5 distinct population segments. So despite the fact that we have met the criteria under the Endangered Species Act, they ruled right before the Biden administration left office that they were not going to delist our grizzly bears. They were going to lump us in with 5 other populations, and we're now going to have to populate those other areas in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Northern California. So they really just ripped the rug right out from under the state of Wyoming in that. I'm trying to delist from the standpoint of legislatively, and just delist the dang things. But also, I think with cooler heads and more common sense within the Fish and Wildlife Service, with Brian Nesvik as the new Secretary of the Fish and Wildlife Service, hopefully they can reverse that decision and we will be able to get them delisted. But we are trying to put more criteria on it so that they cannot use these nebulous concepts to prevent us from delisting. We have a very valid, adequate regulatory mechanism in place on the grizzly bears. They just refuse to acknowledge it. So we're trying to put more guardrails on it so that when we meet the recovery goals, that's done. We're done. It's over. We are going to delist. And that's what we need to move forward with, because the agency has really, the agency's been very, very unfair to states like Wyoming that we do such an incredibly good job of recovering species. They have been very unfair in turning their species over to us for long-term management. Yes, Larry?
Yeah, Harry, just to follow up on that, at one time the Fish and Wildlife Service did delist for about 2
Yes.
weeks,
Yeah.
but could you speak to the issue? What routinely happens when we do have a common sense?
We have a bad judge in Montana. We have a bad judge in Montana who will relist these things. So we've got bad judges in Montana and Idaho both. And if they can, they come in and they're the ones that issue these decisions that really don't affect them or their citizens. But because there's that little sliver of Montana where the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, then he has jurisdiction. And so that's what happened. We have delisted. They delisted twice. But both times you had a judge come in and reverse what the Fish and Wildlife Service can do. So again, that's part of the judicial issue that you're talking about. We have rogue judges that make bad political decisions.
What are some of your personal thoughts on Doge and what Elon Musk has found to waste and stuff? What are some of your personal
So she asked me about Doge, and what I will say about Doge is that this is probably the closest that we're ever going to be to getting zero-based budgeting. And so I actually am very supportive because I've been asking for accountability for a long, long time. And whether it's in the state or it's in the federal government, what zero-based budgeting would do is it would allow you to go into an agency and look line by line by line. How are they spending their money? And that's essentially what Elon Musk is doing. And he started with USAID. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I was one of 70 people in the House who voted a year ago to abolish USAID because I knew what it was. I was well aware of the toxic ideology that it was trying to push around the world. It was not an agency we should have been funding. But even whether it is the Department of Education or the Department of Agriculture, there are a lot of things that our agencies are doing that they probably shouldn't be doing, or that power ought to come back to the states where it belongs. So I look at this as nothing more than a form of zero-based budgeting, where he's going in and looking at each of those budgets. And the other night I was excoriated because somebody, when I made a comment about what USAID, they got very angry and said, there are good things that came out of USAID. And I said, yes. And in fact, Rubio has gone through, Secretary of State Rubio has gone through all 5,000 plus programs that were being funded under USAID, and he found that 17% of them were valid programs that we should have been funding. Those 17%, those programs have been moved over to the Secretary of State's office, to that agency, and those programs are continuing to be funded and operated around the world. So that is, I think, exactly what we ought to be asking at any level of government. You know, I've been meeting with your folks here today trying to figure out how do we get medical care in this community? How do we provide long-term services like that for all of you? And it's complicated. You guys know it a lot better than I do. It's a very complicated issue. But the only way that we're going to do that is if we're smart in the way that we set it up. But there has to be accountability in how we set it up too. For some reason, we've gotten this mindset that no matter what the federal government does, we have to tolerate it. And I just don't believe that. I think we have every right to look at what we do. We have every right to look at what these agencies do. And maybe 20 years ago, there was a program that we were funding that was a good idea, but maybe it isn't anymore. Maybe we've moved beyond that. Maybe we ought to be redirecting those assets to something where they're better spent, which I think is a classic example of the Endangered Species Act when we don't delist species that are recovered. Because keep in mind, when we keep species on that list, we're continuing to spend money on them when we could be spending money on the whooping crane or the California condor, or species that are actually endangered or threatened. Yet we're continuing to spend money on wolves and grizzly bears when they're already recovered. That doesn't make any sense. That's a misdirection of assets. So when I look at Doge, the only thing I think he's doing is, like he says on his t-shirt, he's tech support. He's just looking at what's going on in every one of these agencies, and I'm cool with that. I'm going to see if there's a couple more people who haven't asked yet. So the gentleman here in the red cap.
I would like you to, this is a Wyoming question. I would like it if you would explain to the people here and me what is going on with the Mineral Trust Fund, where the money goes that comes from the Mineral Trust Fund back into the state of Wyoming from interest, and the amount of the Mineral Trust Fund and the amount that's coming back to the state of Wyoming from that program.
So I'm not the best person to ask. All I can give you is the little bit of information that I have after living in this state as long as I have. And the Mineral Trust Fund is that a certain percentage of the money that we receive off of the royalties that we get for oil and gas development, mining, uranium, coal, it goes into what's called the Mineral Trust Funds. And then that money is invested by the state treasurer, Kurt Meyer, and as with any account, especially one of that magnitude, it generates quite a bit of revenue. The interest that comes off of that account is used to pay for general fund spending. Now, these gentlemen up here know better than I do because I'm not at the state level, but that is my understanding from a very simplistic standpoint of how that works. I don't know what the current number is, but I remember a couple of years ago, it was about $100 million in interest that was going, and it's higher than that now, which I assume that it would be. There's only 3 states in the nation that have mineral trust funds: Alaska, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Alaska is the biggest, I believe ours is the second, and New Mexico is the third. But what it's done is has allowed us so that we don't have an income tax. It has allowed it so that we've been able to keep other taxes relatively low as compared to other states, because we're using the interest off that account to pay general fund expenses. But that's about all I know. That's because I'm not at the state level.
You don't have any totals on the amount of the mineral trust fund or the money that comes back in other than.
Larry could answer that question.
I'll talk to him later.
Okay. He can, I don't know, the last I heard, maybe I'm wrong, 30?
11 billion in the permanent mineral trust.
There's 11 billion in permanent mineral trust fund. There are other accounts that have additional savings in that. But again, that's not me. Kurt Meyer manages that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I've got time for 2 more questions. Right over here, Joey.
Thank you, Representative. Knowing that you don't need a pardon if you're not guilty of anything, the new concern about this auto pin signature, how realistic is it that we're going to see President Trump pull back these pardons and truly question whether President Biden signed these things or something signed them on his behalf?
We know from the evidence that's been presented by the Heritage Foundation that he didn't sign the documents because it was an auto pen. The question becomes, what is the validity of a signature on a document where intent is necessary to carry out the purpose of the document? And I think that is ultimately where this question is going to be asked and answered. I don't know the answer to the question, but I don't think that it would be terribly difficult to figure out where he was, what he was doing in his interaction with his staff at the time that those signatures were being made. So when you have something like the pardons, which is kind of the high profile situation because of the thousands, the tens of thousands, the or not tens of thousands, but the thousands of pardons that he signed. But there are other documents that are also as troubling. The only document that they were able to find that he actually signed, and I find this so interesting, is the document where he agreed that he would not run for re-election. And he actually signed that document. The others were done by auto pen. Now, where I think that the bigger issue is who was signing his signature, who was making the decisions, because you don't have the right to, even if you have access to my auto pen, if I had such a thing, you still don't have the right to sign my signature. If you do that, as a form of forgery. And that's where I think that the larger question is where we need to dissect this, is where was he, when was the decision made, who was involved in the decision, and did he have the mental capacity to have the intent to sign that document? And if so, did he instruct someone to do it with an auto pen? If I were to do a will, and I sign that with an auto pen, if I don't have the intellectual wherewithal to make that decision, that will can be challenged in court. And that's the same with some of these documents. Not all of them, but when you look at these documents, the purpose of them has to have an intent behind them. And if he didn't have the intent because he didn't know they were being signed, I think that there is a larger issue there that we need to be looking into. I don't know what is ultimately going to happen with it, but I think we sure have the right to find out who was the one making the decision to do all of these all of the actions, especially in the last 8 weeks of his presidency. Who was involved in those decisions? I do know in one case he was out of the country. I don't remember exactly which document it was, but it was quite significant that he signed a document and he wasn't even in the country to sign it. I think we have a legitimate right to determine what conversations took place between he and the staff and whether he had the intellectual wherewithal to be making the decision at the time. Just one last question. All right.
I'm just kind of tied into that.
Okay.
How did all this money get shifted and sent out where there was a place on the document for whoever was funding it, doing it, whatever was in charge? They didn't sign, they just went ahead and paid.
The way they put it is they were throwing gold bars off the Titanic. They were shoving money out the door as fast as they possibly could to try to get their programs implemented, regardless of whether it's what the American people wanted or whether the accounts were even in place. I think that the most famous situation is the $20 billion that Lee Zeldin at EPA has clawed back that went into an account that had just barely been opened, and then part of the money had been distributed to a company that had only been in existence for a matter of months at that point. Therefore, no vetting, no how does that money get there, what is the oversight of the money, what is the accountability for the money. I don't know about you, but I think $20 billion is an awful lot of money, and that was just the one circumstance. So Lee Zeldin has clawed that back, but I'll just flat out say it, it's graft, it's corruption. It's just not the way our government ought to be operated. If there's money sitting in accounts and they're not spent at the end of a particular administration, you don't just shove it out the door to give it to anybody who could possibly take it, because that's violating the public trust. Every single dime that comes into the federal government, that's our money. That is our money. That comes from fees, that comes from taxes, but that money is to be used for us. This is a government of, by, and for the people. We're the ones in charge. We're the ones who decide how things should be done. And we do that through our representatives, but at the same time, there has to be accountability. And it would be wrong for me to be throwing gold bars off the Titanic. It was wrong for anybody to throw gold bars off the Titanic. But that's the lack of accountability, and that's why when I look at Doge and I see people's heads exploding over that, and they keep saying it's an unelected billionaire, and I'm like, well, 90% of the people who work in Washington, D.C. are unelected. That's not the standard by which we determine whether they can engage in the government. The standard is whether they're good, upstanding people and they're doing the right thing and they're following the law. For us, it's whether we're accountable to you and also complying with the law. So, I think that whole thing is pretty wild, but I think that it just demonstrates that they were trying to get as much money out the door as they could. When they did the IRA, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, The amount of money that went into that bill, it's why we have the inflation we do. The inflationary pressures that were unleashed by the IRA is why we've suffered for 3.5 years. They did that through reconciliation, by the way. But when they did that, when they spent that massive amount, when they started appropriating that massive amount of money, it was so much money. They knew they weren't even going to be able to spend it in that amount of time. We lose sight of the fact that $1 trillion is a mind-blowing amount of money. Mind-blowing. And they're spending trillions of dollars, and we don't have any accountability until we bring in Elon Musk to start looking line by line. I would think everybody would be celebrating what he's doing, because it's the first time we're going to have some accountability. You know, again, I want to thank you all for being here. I know you're feeding cows and calving and trying to dig out of the ditch and all of those things, and it is very nice. This is a great turnout here. It's great to be here in Bags. I was here several years ago for the Bags Ball. I enjoy coming back here. It's difficult to get here, and you all know that. But I'm glad that I was able to come down and spend some time with you, spend some time with the people who are trying to make your community better, some of your leaders. I really do appreciate all of you. Sharon, it's wonderful to see you and your family. It's great to see you again. And I just want to thank you all for being here, for listening. Stay in touch with me if you've got an issue with an agency, whether it's the IRS or the VA, the issue that you have raised. Get a hold of my office. That's what we're here for. That's our job. That's what we do with constituent services. I think that we have opened 3,200 cases since I came into office, and I think we've resolved 3,000 of them. So we have a pretty good metrics in terms of our constituent services, but it's a big part of what we do. I was just trying to find that document in here. It's a big part of what we do, and please stay in touch with me. Thank you all. Thank you.